Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and students and scholars. Thanks for joining the meeting this morning, the presentation. I'd like to introduce Fadzai Pwiti. Fadzai is an environmentalist who specializes in social inclusion and community engagement, particularly in the minerals and mining sector. She currently works with Climate Resilient Infrastructure Development Facility, that's a CRIDF, which is based in Hatfield, Pretoria, and is doing EIAs with Engineerix, an engineering consultancy in Pretoria East. It's very, very interesting and topical, I guess, that Fadzai is going to talk to us this morning. And as I just said, it's going to be more of an interactive discussion session. She will give us some of her insights. We've all seen recently the sad events at Richards Bay Minerals, what's gone on in places like Orion down at Prieska. And it's something that's happening more and more in this country as service delivery gets worse, sadly, and as communities start looking towards mining companies to provide those services that the government or municipalities aren't doing. Anyway, that's for Fadzai to discuss. Thanks, Fadzai. Thanks for making yourself available. And we look forward to your input and discussion here or leadership in this presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, John, for the platform and organizing everything. So my topic is going to be ensuring community participation and social inclusion in developmental projects. And the buzz question is going to be, are we really winning? Is everything we're doing, is it bringing forth the results that we expect? So this is basically going to be the flow of the presentation. It's going to be very short, and there's going to be a lot of questions within the presentation and at the end as well. So I'm going to start with legislation and pollution, and we're going to look at the community where the gigantic diamond was found recently, the Debswana case study. Then we're going to look at the Richards Bay case study as well, and then we're going to discuss the questions and conclude. So obviously the mining law is regulated by MPRDA, but the buzz question that we face mostly when we go into the communities is where the people who hold the native titles or other statutory surface use rights, is there an impact that they have in terms of exploration or mining operation? And under the MPRDA, what they say is that even if people are holding land rights or its communal rights to the land, this is not supposed to hinder any type of mining operation. And this is always a big issue in communities because that makes them very pensive when we go in. And they're mostly aware about this land rights situation because they feel powerless when consultancies come in and do the public participation. In some communities, they won't even allow you to come in despite whatever you do. And that's been a case that keeps happening in Amadipa and Eastern Cape, and we see it across South Africa all the time. So what are we finding on the ground? I think the biggest bone of contention is the poverty in communities, in mining communities. There's a lot of unemployment, there's a lot of sickness and health issues, which is being traced back to the mining operations because of the water pollution, the air pollution, all the pollution. And also another big bone of contention is there have been reports where people feel like they've lost out on whether it's their land, in some cases it's livestock, and there's no compensation to the extent where the community feels satisfied. So that's another bone of contention that we face when we do things like public participation. It's that when they hear that there's going to be a mining operation proposing to come and mine in their areas, they start thinking of the cases where people have lost out on their land and have lost out on their livestock. And there's also a very big issue in terms of the resettlement programs. So in most cases, land, for example, during the exploration phase and they find minerals or in communities, there's going to be a resettlement rollout. But in some cases, they find that the areas where they're being relocated to are not favorable or they don't like those particular areas. And it's always one of the main points that they push forward to try and push the mining operations out. So we're going to look at Jwaneng village, which is where they found the recent big diamond. It's being called the third largest diamond ever found, and it's smaller than the Cullinan. It's about a little bit over 1,000 carats, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure. So it's a really big buzz right now. The announcement was a few days ago, or it could have been yesterday, June 16th. So this village is actually quite famous for having a very low poverty rate. So it's in Botswana, and it's kind of going against the narrative that we have in our communities in South Africa to say that most mining communities are poverty stricken and the communities are not happy. They want to push the mining operations out. In Jwaneng, they have a very low poverty rate, and a lot of people have been asking, why is that? Why is it different from most of the other case studies that we bump into where poverty is rampant, the pollution is out of hand, and all of that? So if you dig a little bit, you find that Jwaneng, as a town, was established apparently by the mine. So for people to come and live in this village, they had to be approved at its inception. They had to be approved by the mine, and most theorists are saying that this is the main reason why they've managed to keep a handle on things like pollution and poverty, because they have to, the mining entity approves who comes into the community and who stays, meaning that they keep a handle on things like employment and resource use in the village. But it's important to take note that in Jwaneng, there are some social ills that are going on. For example, there is a location called Sama Paleche, which is reported to be dilapidated, and the Botswana Housing Committee is proposing that they rehabilitate that particular location. But to be able to rehabilitate that location, they need to do a resettlement rollout. But unfortunately, this has not been going well because they've been planning to do this for the past over 20 years. So in as much as they have a very low poverty rate and a good handle on their pollution and other ills in the communities, they have their own issues. For example, this housing issue in Sama Paleche, which is the example in this case. So looking at the Jwaneng mine, they do have a very attractive community engagement and inclusion policy. For example, they have a very good housing plan for the community. They have a very good amenities. They have water. They have you really get complaints in their community engagement. But there's an issue that was raised recently about their diamond value chain, because in the way they explain their value chain, it has been noted by two researchers that they have not included any community engagement or development aspect in their value chain from the beginning to the end of their whole value rollout. I'm not sure if you can see this clearly, but I've included a link to this particular document with the diamond value chain according to Steps 1. And this goes against what has been said in the legislation and the community engagement entities that support diamond mining in Botswana. And unfortunately, because the mining entities and companies don't really work hand in hand with the people who roll out the legislation. It's working basically in silos. So that's a very big bone of contention to say that the policies that are proposed and sometimes implemented don't really talk to the needs of what is on the ground, basically. So looking at the Richards Bay case, I'm sure we're all familiar with what happened, was it a few months ago? In May, actually, with general managers passing away. So I'm going to say, unfortunately, the rollout of events that happened in Richards Bay recently, it does not give a good picture of what is happening in the South African mining sector. Because this is not the first case. There have been many recorded cases, and it seems like there's no action and there's no one is changing anything in regards to what is happening. So despite complaints from the unions, despite lobbyists going into communities and approaching the authorities, voicing their concerns, the way things roll out, I feel like it looks like it gives double negatives at the end of the day, because the unions and communities don't gain anything from the way things are handled in regards to the differences between authorities and mining entities. But there's a very good paper that is looking at the Richards Bay Minerals case study by OTT. And I hope when you guys get time, you can have a look at this paper. It really goes in depth into the kinds of social ills and how the whole situation continues to repeat itself, especially in Richards Bay with the murders as well. So one of the main questions that comes up would be, what causes the ambiguities in the existing law regulating community participation processes in mining projects, including MPRDA and the guidelines? I'm hoping that through the questioning process, we can try and maybe poke around and see what the way forward could be. Because the clear picture is that there's not much community engagement, and the proposed social inclusion policies are not being acted upon. I can't see. Sorry. I'm trying to. So basically, that's I'm at the end of my presentation now.
Okay, thanks, Fadzai. I mean, that's useful, a useful lead, and you picked two very interesting examples. One, Joneng in Botswana, and then obviously Richards Bay, which is very topical. So So maybe what we need to do, Henny, is get people back on their videos and microphones, and then we can start discussing some of these issues and pass questions back to Fadzai to sort of counter, given her experience, and take this process forward. So do you want to unload your screen, Fadzai, and then we can get the videos on?
Okay.
Unshare, yeah.
Okay, guys, you can come on. You can unmute yourself, stick your hand up, or just start speaking. We will. Fadzai, if you can just unshare.
I'm looking for
Mine
the button.
Has mine gone frozen?
It'll be at the top of her screen, will it, Henny?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, there we go. Yeah. All right, we've got everyone from students to minors in the room. So and just to kick off, Fadzai, I mean, what you had that list of points. I mean, what do you see as a solution? I mean, our legislation has good intent, but given South African circumstances and the way that it's rolled out and the fact that it's rolled out so terribly slowly. You know, what would you suggest if you were setting up new legislation, or you know, how would you solve a problem like Richards Bay? Tough question.
I don't think the issue lies with the legislation. I think the issue definitely lies with the application of the legislation. Also, I think we need to really lay heavily into the social inclusion to try and incorporate the communities we were farming mining in some of the processes that will be happening, so that they can get a clear picture of how it happens. Also, transparency is a big one, because sometimes there's not much transparency, so they don't know what's happening, which breeds the wrong kind of curiosity from the end of the community.
Okay.
So how do we get the community members and the mining entities to talk to each other? How do we bridge this polarization?
I think we need to do away with the stigma to begin with, because the narrative that mining entities are just here to destroy has just spread like a wildfire. So I think it might be maybe a marketing issue. Go on a rollout plan to try and help people understand that mining entities are not there to destroy, and there's a possibility for people in the communities to work together with the mining entities, which would benefit the communities. In actual fact, in some areas, I read a case study in the Amadiba area. What they have tried to do is they've tried to roll out some scholarships for some of the students who come from the areas. So because it's people who are from that area, they are already in the community, people will feel better to come and approach them and try and understand the whole process, instead of just getting people who are not from the area to come in and roll out the whole public participation process and even the mining process. So it takes both sides to kind of try and work together to be able to resolve the conflict and do away with the stigma.
Okay, someone like Andrew, I mean, you might have comment. You from Johannesburg, you've worked and been involved, for example, in the acid mine drainage, and you are probably better than most of us see the legacies of the old dumps and the dust, etc., around that area. And I guess sadly, one of the biggest problems in South Africa is so many of these are legacy issues, and it's a case really of how you can start to reverse those issues. And maybe John James as well, having been involved in the gold sector, has also got comment there. And what would have you got some comments to add to this, Andrew? Are you there, Andrew or John?
Sorry, John. I just got caught away for a minute, so I missed the
Okay.
previous few minutes. Apologies.
Okay. Okay, well, don't go away. I'm just saying that you've worked firsthand with the acid mine drainage problems and many of the legacies around a city like Joburg, which obviously impact on communities as well. I mean, how do we address the legacy issues, and then we can look at how we go forward in new projects in this country. Comment.
Yeah, I mean the legacy issue is largely, and the underground acid mine drainage wasn't really having much impact until it started decanting, and then it had impacts on the streams, and some communities downstream who perhaps might have been using those streams as water resources. So, but once it stopped decanting, then the biggest legacy from acid mine drainage is the runoff from old mine dumps when they were being reworked, whether the containment around the reworkings was satisfactory, and the mine dumps did have collection systems around them, but at various stages they didn't get maintained properly. So then, and this other part of it, which was, I don't know the numbers or anything, but was the windblown pollution, which is probably even more serious because it's more difficult to manage, and because it's very, very dispersed and you can't escape it. You can warn people and provide alternative water sources so that the polluted water doesn't necessarily have to be used, although in many cases it is. But the wind pollution, which caused lung problems and stuff, was very difficult, and trying to see who was accountable for the mines, the mine dumps. The mines might not exist anymore. Somebody took over the land, somebody owns it, and the landowner is actually responsible for whatever they took over, warts and all. But that seemed to be a very difficult thing to get to grips with.
Fadzai? Yeah, having been involved with gold mining for about 10 years back in the previous century, there's a mindset within the mining community, and we've got to admit to that. It's driven by profit, which brings down, to try and so they want to maximize that, and they've always, now they try to get away with as little as possible. And what about these days? Would it be advantageous, or does something like that already exist, where maybe as part of the sort of education of the mining community themselves, all the staff, that you should bring in a module, like you get ventilation, you get safety, that they also get sensitized to the community involvement, that there's some part of their training involves them realizing in which area they're working and who they're working with, so that there's an interaction or an understanding being created with, and slowly changing that mindset of the profit-driven idea, which puts large pressure on these guys, to get away with as much as they can, and that is where they start shortchanging everything else that they can get away with.
Just a thought. I mean, in the mining, when we were doing some consulting work for one of their mining houses, we were consulting to their environmental group, and more than one occasion, we had a project which had been approved to go ahead, and they said, sorry, the funding for that project's been cut because they're moving that funding to something that will produce minerals, ore. And we're at the bottom of the pecking order in the environmental group in terms of getting work done. So, and it's not the technical people that didn't understand the issues. It's the person that's controlling the purse strings, I guess, and the higher level people. And it take a long time for that education to get through to that level, I suspect.
Comments on that, Fadzai?
I think it's a very good point, but it's very difficult to navigate because of the profit issue. And in most cases, I'm sure there would be some sort of caveat to say that people need to be sensitized, but because of the maximization of the profits, the person who controls the purse strings, to take Indru's statement, would be more interested in cutting down the budget than having to sensitize people who are running. So it's a very difficult issue to navigate. But I think it would be better to try and incorporate that maybe at the corporation level, to try and sensitize them to the issues that they are going to face on the ground. Because sometimes when you're doing those environmental consultations where there's going to be public participation, they come to those meetings already with the perception that these people are going to try and shortchange us, and that's going to affect our profits. So it's a bit difficult to maneuver that issue of sensitizing.
Climbing over the fence, I would also suggest that government or somebody provides mentorship to the communities, have somebody embedded to train them not to come with hands saying we want freebies, but to structure their approach to management such that management can see there's benefit that's going to come from there, but with certain aspects of funding, to teach the community what they can expect and how they can achieve working together by asking the right kind of support for their existence.
Yeah. If I can extend on that, Tenny, I mean, I think we've got to sort of, revisit the whole picture and come up with something new. I mean, I speak from personal experience, having run, a junior small company in the Northern Cape. But one of the big problems we have too is the social and labour plan, and I think you touched on it, Fadzai. It just never works, and it never gets to the right people. When you run a mining operation, you also meant to work with the local municipalities and work into or support their local development projects. And again, you find that if you're working, and it's particularly bad in South Africa right now, if you work with the municipality, most of them are so broken and so incapable, that social and labour plans, and you've probably got experience of this, Fadzai, that they never actually, get going, or they never achieve what they meant to. And so we found in the Northern Cape, for example, with our social and labour plan, we managed to bend the rules a bit, and we got permission from the DMR to actually do that. So we would go straight to schools, for example, and actually work with schools on programs that they needed to sustain their education. And obviously it was a bit easier in small municipalities like Kimberley or the Berkeley West and some of the others. And interestingly too, we also ended up working very closely with women's groups. We found that the women, particularly out in the Northern Cape again, and I think, and I've seen that apply just about everywhere in this country, the women tend to hold the fabric of the family and local societies together somewhat better. And we worked very well and very successfully with women on projects for, be it nursery schools or teaching. market gardens producing fresh produce. And I guess it was part of capacity building as well. And to me, I think one of the biggest problems out in these rural communities is just the sheer lack of capacity, or lack of infrastructure, or lack of local authorities that can actually do things. And again, we've just seen a classic example of that with the diamond rush outside Ladysmith. And I can't believe that in this day and age, and it's now almost a week since that deposit was found, no one from the CGS has been there and issued a report and made it public that these things are not diamonds. And there we've got, supposedly thousands of people digging in the dirt looking for diamonds. And this year, 2021, we should be much smarter at addressing issues like that on the ground. So that's my input, Fadzai. I mean, do you think the social and labour plan as it currently is set up works?
Unfortunately, it's not very well thought through, and it's a little bit old. I think you've raised an important point to say that we need to kind of revamp it and find out ways that work with the current situation on the ground.
Yeah.
Okay. Andrew Canna, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, right at the other end of the spectrum, and I'm not sure about in the mining industry, but I mean, it's the shareholders that are wanting profit from the mines to increase the value of shares. And in some sectors, there are shareholder groups that are actually starting to get companies to be a little bit more environmentally friendly. I guess the biggest area where it's perhaps having some impact is in climate change, where there's quite a bit of that, and recent judgments in the Netherlands to get Shell to reduce their emissions is a major step in terms of government acting against a company, but probably partly shareholder pressure. And there is shareholder pressure on them, but I don't know that that's very active in the mining sector in this country. And the shareholders are dispersed perhaps far away from the country, so they're not actually very concerned about what's happening down here.
Comment on that, Fadzai?
I think Andrew is very correct, especially with his last point, to say that the shareholders are not necessarily from this country or this area. So it becomes difficult for them to be cognizant of the fact that people are actually going through some serious poverty, and for them to reverse that, it would be, they would feel like it would bring down their share price. So maybe to take from some of John's points, to incorporate some of the local population in, I don't know if it's possible, to try and have more local people sitting on boards and owning more shares, so that at least the people who are concerned and mostly affected get a say in how to try and reverse the current situation that is in most mining towns.
Thank you. John James?
And then Jock Harmer's got his hand up as well.
Yeah, John, if you can just unmute.
I don't have much experience with what happens later, but I've been, in the past 20 years, I've dealt with many feasibility studies, particularly in the east and western wings of the bushveld, and quite often with quite small startup companies, where the whole point of the feasibility is really to see if it's the deposit is worth mining, and then go and find shareholders. And a large portion of the problem of the feasibility study, let's not call it, the challenge for the feasibility study is to get the local community involvement according to the Act, because you're dealing with a lot of minor entities, little small villages and little power structures, and that I'm not sure it's the same everywhere, but in particularly on the eastern limb, I've seen very small developments where they've started initial mining, and between visits, it's like watching urbanization of a city. The first couple of visits, the area is pretty rural with maybe 1 or 2 settlements. Come back in 6 months' time, and the whole area is suddenly a settlement. So if a startup starts on a mining lease somewhere particularly in those more populated areas of South Africa, the number of people who move in because they see it as a potential source of, well, obviously of income, but of all the other things that come with urbanization is there. And so then it then becomes a cycle, because the amount of community development that's got to be dealt with is now much larger, and it's than was originally dealt with in the feasibility study. And it's a continual, or not a continual, but it seems to be an ongoing cycle. And as more people come in, there are more needs and more conflicts, and management has to deal with those all the time. And especially when you have a fairly marginal, small mining endeavor, that can eventually lead to the mining being closed down or even or put on in mothballs. I think that's. I don't know if you have any comments, Fadzai.
Thanks, John. Fadzai?
Yes, I think in the case of the Debswana mine in Jwaneng, that's where they managed to keep a good handle on the increase in the amount of people who came into the town, because they treated it at the beginning as a private town. So they were the ones who were in control of the urbanization and the rate at which people move into the town. So that gave them a good track record. Also, I think it helped in terms of planning. They planned the town in such a way that they have a good handle on the urbanization, on the housing situation, on the resources that are going around, on the employment rate as well. So I understand. I don't understand the logistics that go behind privatizing a town to that extent, to the extent of the way they rolled out the Jwaneng situation. But John raised a very good point in terms of the rate at which urbanization happens in situations where there's a new mining entity, especially if it's not as big of a mining entity. It's people easily underestimate the opportunities that are surrounded by a mining entity, and if it gets flooded by people, then in some situations there's nothing you can do to try and handle it, because there will be so many people already.
Thanks, Fadzai. Jock?
Yeah, 2 issues. Just touching on what was talked about just now. I take last October, I took a student up in the Eastern Bushveld and took a drive from Port Zanin down towards down along the Crocodile River, and the amount of new occupation there is massive. And you can virtually see continuous working of the open pit working of the chrome seams over tens of kilometers, and 90% of that is artisanal illegal mining. And it's going on there. We hear about illegal mining in the gold industry. I mean, you can take your profits in your pocket and walk off with it. Chrome and these are bulk commodities. And there are, the people that are doing it have huge trucks. they're putting in roads and everything. And, you know, the DMR are not actually enforcing the rules. And so therefore it's not being stopped. So it's not necessarily always the mining companies. These are the actual, if you want to say, community people doing illegal things and actually having massive impact on the environment stuff. So, you know, and I think one of the problems we have is a lack of enforcement. We've got lots and lots of red tape that in fact isn't enforced. In other words, the mining companies have to go through that, but in the end, the protections that red tape is supposedly putting in place are not there. And you have things like Kolobeni on the Transkei coast, and that's another issue we could talk about. The other thing, to get back to the story about the board and the big mining companies, you know, doing more to that, we have to bear in mind that in South Africa, in order to get an exploration permit all the way through to a mining company, 26% of the shares are in the hands of BE, previously disadvantaged, whatever you want to call it. What are they doing? You know, they will have or should have positions on the board. They are part of the decision-making process. And I think, you know, I don't hear much criticism of that aspect. It's in this big black box called the mining company. I think that's very dangerous, to be a little bit provocative.
Fadzai?
Yeah, I agree, because there's this big issue that is seldom addressed especially in regards to that 26% which you mentioned last. And you find that usually the people who are within that 26% are actually community leaders who are very vocal. So it becomes a difficult situation, because there are issues around bribing and monies that are exchanged so that things can go ahead and run, even though it's to the detriment of the project, one, two, also the community. So unfortunately, some of the situations involved are, I think we can consider them as political. And I'm not too sure. It's a very big gray area.
Yeah,
Before I hit you with my curveball question, Fadzai, what is the impact of COVID been on the situation with, you know, in marginalized communities?
Yeah, Henny, can I just follow up on Jock's question? I think you've raised
Okay.
another critical question which also needs debate. I think Jock's hit two critical issues firmly on the head. The one, obviously, is incapacity and dysfunctionality of our DMR. And of course, hand in hand with that, sadly, goes the local municipalities and even the big municipalities.
The council of youth.
Yeah, and you can name all of the institutions which are just not functioning as they should. And then the second one is a critical one too. I mean, sadly, we've all been there. We all know people who have been, black empowerment partners, etc. And again, with no disrespect, yes, we should have transformed the industry by now. And BEE, I think, has been. I firmly agree that it needs to happen. Transformation needs to happen. It's overdue. But BEE has been so much about enrichment and absent ownership. So yes, you've got a BEE partner. My experience all too often, probably like Jock's, is that BEE person, gets a free car and a nice house somewhere in Johannesburg, and he's an owner, but he's absent. He's never really on the ground and active in the business. And I'm sure you found that, Jock. And to me, that's one of the biggest problems we face in this situation. As I say, transformation has to be done. We've done it far too slowly. But BEE, I think, still has some very fundamental flaws. But that's probably for another discussion sometime. So back to your question, Henny. Fadzai? Okay,
yes.
Back to Henny's question. And then we should pick up on Botswana to finish off. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. So I'm going to address John's question about the COVID situation. in my experience, there is one project that I can discuss in this regard. The funding has been severely affected to the extent that some of the projects have been halted. And another issue is that because of lockdown, some of the government entities, for example, DWS, they were in a very long lockdown from March until maybe March, April, May, June, until June 2020. They were not processing any licenses or even looking at any of the projects. So that puts a very big strain on most projects because of the delays involved with the whole lockdown issue. So that's been my experience so far in terms of the pandemic.
Thank you. Yeah, Fadzai, I would like to know from you and from Ayabulela, you know, because we are fossils, we basically, you know, we've got our opinions and we can give input there, but you're the new generation. What do you intend to do? How do you intend to approach this thing? How do you hope to interact? And what do you, like, for instance, yourself, where do you intend to go with your information and how do you think it's going to be applied?
Ayabulela, do you have anything to?
Okay, so what I can say is that firstly, I am doing also a kind of a feasibility study in Willowvale with the dolerites, with the mining of the dolerites in that area. So some of the problems that are mentioned here, I've actually come across because I remember last year when we went, I think it was around October, we went and we, because those lands that are there, they are under chiefs, they are, so you can't just go there and explore and do anything. You first have to let the chief know that you're around and everything. So as we were going in, we did come across an abandoned mine, and it had a lot of dolerites that were already cut. It seemed as if they're ready to be transported, but for some reason, the mining operation stopped, right? So as we were there, some of the community members passed by and they were furious. So they were like, what are you doing here? You have absolutely no business being, it was really scary for me because it was the first time that I actually came across that. So to me, when I did more to find out what actually the problem is, it came across that there's not much community, there was not enough community involvement in those processes, so much that it got to a point where the community stopped the mining operation that was going on there. So for me, I think going forward, adding to what has already been mentioned, is that there has to be more community involvement in all the processes and procedures, and also opening up the community. I think it was mentioned that you find that a lot of these communities are ready to receive a lot of things, but rather open their mind that it's not really practical, that you're going to get everything or everything is going to be easy to get, but rather what is real, you know? So I think more community involvement. And I think also the problems come from places where these community members feel as though they're losing their sense of place. These people have been here for maybe a number of years. They've got traditions and history that is here. So like finding ways to ensure that people don't really lose their sense of place, they are more involved. I think that's kind of the direction that I'm heading for. So I don't know if I've answered the question.
I think you've answered it very well, and we're going to propose that you get into you know, the president's boots or books, and you go and talk to him directly, and Gwedi Mantashe, our minister Mantashe. You know, he needs young people like you to stir him up.
Thank you very much, John.
Okay, right. Fadzai, you got any comments?
I think just more inclusion, to try and consult the community more, civil society organizations, that are on the ground in whatever community, just to try and involve women's groups more, because they've been shown that they're more active and action oriented, and the youth as well, to try and get the youth into decision-making roles so that they know how things are run, how they are supposed to be involved, how they can benefit in all those spaces. Yeah.
Thank you. Andrew Tanner, you got your hand up.
Just thinking about the communities. Excuse me. I mean, when we were trying to do community involvement, one of the things we did, which was successful, and sometimes it wasn't, we weren't at all, is to actually understand what the community structures are, because there's elected representatives who you would say, well, the local government, they've been elected by the people, so they represent the people. But that's a mistake to go in that route. And then there are women's groups and other groupings in the community who may or may not be active in various ways. And to actually understand the groupings in the community and try and have a process that's inclusive so that as many people in the community actually have a voice and know what's going on, took quite a lot of time when we were more successful, actually understanding the communities that we're dealing with and the breadth of the community, if you like, and not just the immediate people, but people in nearby areas that were also going to be affected, and trying to understand that, and then trying to make sure that information did get to the actual people on the ground and not just to a few of the people that either attended meetings or a few of the leaders. So actually getting the message down into the people that are actually going to be concerned and may come back later to raise issues because they didn't have any of the background. It was quite a long, slow and tedious process, but in the end, at least in one case, it was quite effective.
Yeah, good point.
Thank you very much, John. I think it's time to wrap up. If you can just bring us all around.
Okay, perhaps just the last point. We obviously Fadzai started with Botswana, Henny, and it's just worth 2 minutes before we do wrap up, and maybe John Blaine can comment as well. You know, some of us have worked there, and one has to give credit to Botswana. It's not perfect, but if you look at how they've managed their resources, they're a shining role model in Africa. And well, in the world for that matter, and then you look at the situation on the ground again, and let's just put it in context: 2.3 million people, all being well educated or generally well educated. It's a lot easier when you're dealing with that sort of numbers compared to the numbers here in South Africa. But as I say, I always found it really interesting there that the processes worked, the management of things like mineral rights, knowing who had mineral rights, how you access mineral rights, how you could apply. The whole structure was just so much better organized and more formal, and I think that worked all the way down to people on the ground. I mean, we doing an exploration program there, and this was in the sort of mid 2000s. We went to, and we had to, we went to great lengths to get into very isolated areas and interact with communities and inform them about the fact that we would be flying a fixed wing to do aeromagnetic and gravity surveys, and it really worked. And you got a lot of positive feedback from people when you do that. And I think, as Andrew just said, it takes time and it takes a lot of legwork, but you can't not do it. And I think my last point on that before John can comment is, again, we see today the big buzz now is ECG, or it used to be HSIC, health, safety, environment, or HSEC, environment and community. Now, of course, it's ECG. And again, in my experience, so much of that stuff it's driven by lawyers, and it's extremely expensive for the company. You look at the millions spent on lawyers by these big companies, you almost wonder if that money couldn't be better, some of that money couldn't be better spent with, community people and specialists on the ground engaging with communities. And that's something I think Fadzai, you might want to comment at a later stage. But just John, I mean, your experiences of Botswana and interaction with communities and working there.
Yeah, look, I mean, my major experiences goes a long way back, and in fact, the most interesting experiences were in the Central Kalahari, where in fact most of our interaction with the local sand communities, which at that stage in the 80s, there was a lot of roaring around De Beers' so-called marginalization of these people. And now we unfortunately did have to bear the brunt of that, because we had discovered some water as well along with the kimberlite, and of course, regardless of the poor quality of the water, they insisted on watering their donkeys and goats and drinking it themselves. Not that that was the big issue, but it was never an issue. We just managed it as the geologists on the ground seemed fit. The worst experiences came when foreigners from North America came and tried to donate bundles of useless donated clothing from well-wishers, and started distributing this, and created unfortunate expectations amongst these marginalized people. So when it comes to government in those days in Botswana didn't really know how to handle the issue, and they tended to try and push it to the side and move people to areas where they had drilled boreholes for new communities for the Bushmen or Sand people. But I think, referring back to South Africa, I think the issue here, as John has said, with all the good intentions of the NPRDA, the lack of education in government and that leads to lack of implementation, because the officials in government have no clue what they're supposed to administer. And of course, that education doesn't get through to the various communities in the languages that they understand, to help the mining companies to interact with the community. So there's no way that you can ask the government to help you, because they haven't got a clue, in my limited experience in South Africa, how to deal with it. Even down at Insizwa in the Eastern Cape province, if it wasn't for the fact that we ourselves went and talked to local communities and involved people in those areas to work on some of the projects we had. And that was really their involvement, that when you're working in our area, employ our people. But because they recognized that we weren't actually mining, we were exploring, they weren't over the top in their expectations. But this was quite early days, almost, it was pre-MPRDA. And I think the MPRDA has given an outline of great expectations, but with a lack of follow through, which I can only lay at the door of the government, with lack of education and lack of understanding by government officials. And if we had had that, along with more widespread basic education of a reasonable standard, we would not be in this predicament.
Yeah, thanks, John. Very, very valid points. Right, any last question, and then let's wrap up. You're right.
Thank you very much, guys.
Okay. Right. Thanks, Fadzai. That was excellent, and thanks to everyone for your contribution.